Thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 Jonas Lecture. The Jonas Lectureship is dedicated in the memory of Robert Jonas, who was a beloved teacher and a very charismatic and talented teacher in zoology. In honor of his memory, the Zoology Club selects a speaker every year, someone that kind of represents the same ideals of charisma and engagement in teaching and outreach. And so I think it's very appropriate that we selected Dr. Jacqueline Frair. Dr. Frair is a professor of wildlife ecology and the director of the Roosevelt Wild Life Station at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Her research spans the globe in a diversity of mammals, from moose to large cats. She has been awarded the Outstanding Professional and Fellow of the Wildlife Society and has been honored by the Campfire Club for her dedication and lifetime work in conservation. And honestly, her honors and accolades just go on and on and on, but to give her some time to speak, I'm going to shut up and say thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. We don't have a laser pointer, do we? That's right, I'll use the mouse. We're good. Okay, so thank you. It is an honor to be here. I really appreciate you showing up on a Tuesday night when it's this pretty outside. It's a tough time to be inside, and so let's see if we can entertain you for a little bit, make it worth your time. So we all know we're living in this era in which very little of the earth has not been changed and in shape and form and function by us, right? Our footprint is pretty huge. And with that, we are causing a biodiversity crisis. The big animals take it on the chin faster than the others. They have large area needs. They come into big conflict with people because we also have large area needs, right? And so 60%, according to the IUCN, 60% of the largest herbivores and carnivores are threatened with extinction currently. Most of our large carnivores are still in decline around the world. And with that, we're losing functional roles in the landscape that have cascading effect to other species and to ecosystem services, including the services we rely on. So it's in our best interest to find ways to keep them in the world. And the key threats to animals the world over is habitat loss and fragmentation. This is still ongoing. It's the biggest threat. It's the no matter where you're looking, that's number one in the world. But on top of that, for large carnivores, persecution through conflict with humans, either through retaliatory killing or other means, utilization, unregulated utilization, I should say, for meat, traditional medicine, for fur, and then depletion of their prey base is a really big problem for the large carnivores. And so obviously depletion of prey also means depletion of our large herbivores. And protected areas have been invoked as like one of the leading mechanisms for slowing biodiversity losses, especially thinking about this for large animals, although we already know they're not big enough. There's not enough of them. They're not as well connected or as well placed in the world as they should be to be really functional for conserving species. And I'm going to talk about, we're going to kind of highlight across a lot of different research projects that we've done that touches on a lot of those themes in various places. And when I organized this talk, I realized a really good second subtitle is Protected Areas and the Places in Between. And we're kind of organizing the research that we talk about in terms, starting with looking at spillover effects of humanity spilling over into parks and degrading their value. We're going to look at really the conservation frontline. So when parks do their job and become source populations that then create dispersers and animals that move out into other landscapes, those borders with parks can be a hot conflict zone in the world. And then we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about the places in between. One in terms of connectivity among source populations, the other about being able to persist in this matrix where all the other land uses happen and how we can make those more friendly for our large animals. All right, we're going to start by looking at Murchison Falls Conservation Area in Uganda. And this was work done by Becky Fuda, who was co-advised by Sadie Ryan and myself. And Becky, so we do a lot of landscape ecology. That's one theme in my lab. And so we started with satellite imagery, looking at the Murchison Falls Conservation Area, looking at productivity in the vegetation and looking for edge effects from the outside in due to cattle grazing and firewood harvest and all the other activities that kind of just pressure from the outside in. And you can see that pressure from the outside very clearly when you look at an image from space and you see that very hard boundary that's very common with protected areas. And Becky also then detected a subtle decline in productivity from the boundary to the interior, edge effects extending up to 6 kilometers depending on the vegetation type, which means that these declines in productivity due to human impacts is impacting upwards of 40% of the protected area. So even just subtle changes in loss of productivity can be important to animals. And in the worst case scenario, the whole park breaks down. And so looking in Angola, where they suffered 3 decades of civil war that displaced over 1/3 of the human population, you can imagine they weren't really paying attention to park boundaries, right? That wasn't a priority. And so all of these white dots, this is 2 different protected areas, and all of the white dots are human settlements that cropped up during those 3 decades. And our friends at Panthera then, after civility was restored and stability came back in, they went in and did, I love this, it's old school technique, not GPS collars, we didn't have to put the big technology and everything. They went out and did track surveys to get a handle on the large mammal community and where they are persisting in this area to get a feeling for the status. And each of those squares is a grid cell that was potentially surveyed. If there was road-based access, because this was a road-based survey, then those grid cells got accessed. And my grad student, Lisanne Petracca, then worked with them to analyze these data and get robust inference. The fact that there was correlation issues on the transects, and so our models get quite complicated. I'm saving you all of that. No math will be shown here tonight. I'm sure you appreciate that. But I'll give you the highlights. And what Lisanne documented was that 89% of the survey units had human sign. So people are everywhere in the park. Livestock were showing up in 79%. The biggest threat based on the sign from shells and animal parts is that bushmeat harvest remains a big threat in this region for the remaining animals. And when she mapped out those effects to look at the community, you can see that a lot of ground has been lost for these animals. And they're up against other protected areas on the border. They're far away from the park margins where most of the settlements occur. And and as the amount of human sign goes up, as I showed here, occupancy goes down. And so one of the interesting points was, so the traditional kinds of habitat measures, vegetation cover, proximity of water, and how much precipitation in the environment, these are typically things we look for in these arid environments as key habitat covariates. Animals did not seem to have strong responses to those. What they were strongly responding to is the presence of humans and areas of security. And this is a common theme when we look in human-dominated landscapes outside parks, is that we start having some breakdowns in traditional habitat associations. We really need to account for the human disturbance effects in the landscape. And so ground is readily lost, and once lost, it is probably not regained, right? It's not readily regained. These are wicked problems in conservation. Humans need food and space too, right? But where protection can be afforded, such as the creation of the Land of the Leopard National Park in far eastern Russia, then these cats show tremendous ability to rebound. And so here, their main prey, the Sika deer, rebounded, and their numbers just keep increasing over time, to the point that what Dina looked at was whether the tigers had rebounded to a number such that they were suppressing the more critically endangered leopard. And after she used camera traps, and they had collared animals and a lot of tracking, and it does not seem that there's any suppression from tiger at this point, although it was a big concern and people were thinking about we needed to harvest tigers to protect the leopard, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that yet. But so protected area is good when we can add them, for sure. And that's a theme we'll come back to at the end, too. And so when the protected areas do their jobs and they create sources of dispersers and other animals that move out into the landscape, that's where people are living chronically with conflict with these animals. And we don't understand it because we don't live with these creatures in our backyards, right? These things are not only a threat to their livelihoods, they're a threat to their lives, and they are not tolerated. And so trying to find a way to help people find the resources and the opportunities to live safely and thrive with these animals has been a long-term goal of our friends at Wild Crew at Oxford University, where they've created, outside of Hwange National Park, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but they created the Long Shields Community Guardians. These are intrepid souls armed only with these noise-making vuvuzelas, which made a big play at the 2010 World Cup, if you remember that. That's when it made the world stage for these things. They're really obnoxious. Armed only with that, as soon as a lion is detected within village lands, they're on it and they're trying to chase it out and push it out, right? So they're getting in between the lions and the livestock. And there's been success since this program was created. I mean, the ultimate goal was to reduce the amount of retaliatory killings on lions and make it more safe for the community, right? So that was the big goal. Definitely improvements in the number of lions being killed. There has been improvements and declines in the number of livestock being killed, but a lot of livestock are still being killed. And so there's always desire to gain efficiencies in the program. If you get the same level of success for less effort, you can put effort in other places and expand the program, right? So that's where we stepped in. And we looked at it from a behavioral ecology standpoint to understand whether the active hazing of these lions was changing their behavior over time in positive ways. And so Lisanne, working with GPS collared lions, she looked at the short-term success being, were they able to push the lion out within 24 hours of starting the hazing program? And then she looked at the long-term success about, were they less likely to return and were they less likely to kill if they did come back into the program, or back into community lands, excuse me. And so she went at this from a behavioral conditioning standpoint, the same kinds of things you'd think about when training your own dog, right? That how early you intervene in problem behaviors getting started, right? That's an important one to look at. Positive reinforcement in that if they've killed before and had success, that's a big win for a lion. They're going to remember that, and that is likely to beget more kills, right? So trying to get them, again, early and where they haven't had a lot of positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement being how often we get on and harass them and how much that harassment might affect their behaviors. And then there's factors such as age and sex that may cause social resistance. Females with cubs, for instance, we found were much less likely to be pushed off than young males. And we looked at environmental resistance because there are times of year when wild prey are more or less available, and that may affect how responsive they are to being hazed. And I love this slide. It made me laugh when Lisanne first showed it to me, that the success of being able to push a cat out of a landscape has everything to do with how many cats you're dealing with, right? And so you've heard the story, it's like herding cats. And so success, very high if you're dealing with 1, 2, maybe 3 lions. You're dealing with a pack of 8, forget about it. They're just gonna split up and get around you and become a very dangerous situation. And in fact, the ones who are traveling in 1, 2, and 3 tend to be the young individuals that don't have a settled pride, and they were the ones more amenable overall to changing behavior, to actually picking up and moving to a whole different landscape and not coming back. And early intervention was really critical. Huge positive reinforcement with, if these animals had a lot of experience killing livestock, that is such a huge source of food, an easy source of food. And hazing, frankly, doesn't cost them that much in terms of fitness consequences. I'd just rather come back and do it again, right? So if they've already got a taste for it, it's really hard to get them off. And so with each additional animal they had killed in the past, that we saw a 15% increase in the likelihood they were going to come back and do it again. And really we had a better than 50% chance of keeping them out for up to 2 months, only if they had ever killed maybe 1, 2, 3 animals before. After that, they're pretty entrenched. Look how quickly they're going to be back tomorrow if they've killed more than 20 animals before. It's part of their life. And consistency is key, and this is where we thought there was the most room for improvement, that for every 1% increase in a lion coming in and getting intercepted, for increasing 1% that rate of interceptions, we could see a 12% decrease in their propensity to return and depredate again. And so this bottom line shows that if we could get as much as 40% of the time they come in, that you're intercepting them and kicking them out, then we can possibly affect long-term behavior. And the baseline during the time that we did this study was only about 10% of the incursions were being intercepted. And so we thought, room for improvement, right? However, it's challenging. So basically we did see there's at the present levels, the present program, there's very little long-term effects on lion behavior. The successes have everything to do with people disrupting a hunt and getting in between them and stopping that first hunt from happening, right? Consistency is key, but almost half of the incursions happen at night when it's way too dangerous to be out there and try to chase these animals. But they still could have some room to improve there. And prioritizing young animals, intercepting them early, being more consistent with the young ones may have the most payoff over time. But clearly, hazing, livestock fortification, removal of these recalcitrant lions, once that bad behavior is established, it's not going to change. And so there's multiple parts to this solution. All right, so now let's think about protected areas and the connectivity among them and the persistence in the so-called matrix, right, the landscape in between. We're going to talk and spend some time thinking about jaguar in Central and South America. So again, our friends at Panthera have, they put a lot of time and money into identifying core patches where jaguar populations are secure. Most of these are strictly protected areas, so these are the gray areas are the jaguar conservation units. These are strictly protected areas mostly that have known jaguar populations in them. Then they did least cost movement path modeling to outline all of these movement corridors, what's the most likely area they would move to get from one to the other, right? So how would gene flow happen if it was likely to happen in these landscapes? So they've done this all across jaguar range. And then they started going corridor by corridor and validating, are jaguar using these and are the large prey still in these landscapes? And they did that through, I mean, imagine, we're talking an enormous, here it's the entirety of Central America, right? This is not a small study site. You're not going to be putting cameras out and following them. And so they used humans as wildlife detectors. And I always thought this was really clever of them to do this. And so this is Ana Patricia Calderon, a former student of mine who did this in Guatemala. And they would go to communities and they would ask who's really knowledgeable about the wildlife locally. And they would start interviewing those, but they'd ask them, who else do you know is knowledgeable? And they would just kind of snowball sample to build up and be able to get all this coverage and then sit down with them, and she's got the maps out saying, well, what areas do you spend time in? What are you comfortable being able to say about? And how often do you get out? And over the course of 6 years and about 3,900 different interviews across this space, each with a different season team. Sometimes it took 4 years in one corridor, sometimes it was one season. And so all of these discrepancies and differences from study sites needed to be accounted for in the model. The other thing we needed to account for was, so false negatives, excuse me, are what all of our base models for looking at animal occurrence deal with. The fact that animals are out there and we fail to detect them when they're there. That's very, very common. All of our statistics deal with that. Less often we deal with a case of false positives where maybe it's mistaken identity, or in the case of dealing with people, perhaps they're telling us what we want to hear rather than the truth, or they have a mistaken recall about when they saw the animal or where they saw the animal. And so real possibility for false positives in this kind of study. And so one way we guarded against that was spending a lot of time with them, kind of testing their ability to tell us they really know what they're looking at, right? And making sure we're dealing with knowledgeable people to begin with. The second way is fitting a so-called false positive model. And so we will come back to that point in a second. So accounting for all those potential biases and pulling it all together to get robust inferences into what's driving jaguar occurrence across all of those corridors. This is what the main effects were. And certainly they made sense in terms of jaguar like to be in low elevation forested systems. They're found closer to protected areas, further from human settlements, and in areas where there's less agriculture. All of that makes sense, really easy to monitor. This one is the one I'm most interested in, the fact that they also were more likely to be where there was a greater diversity of their prey species, so where the large mammal community was mostly intact. And I point that one out because that's the only one we can't measure from space. So all these other covariates we can readily measure from satellite images and get a handle on how it looks for jaguar. But we got to get on the ground. You have to know what's going on under that forest canopy. And this empty forest syndrome was coined several decades ago now to capture that effect that we can see the forest, but we don't know what's going on underneath, and we can't just infer that things are there because the trees are. And so with this model, then Lisanne is able to predict out. So she fit the models both for individual large prey species and then for jaguar as a whole to be able to map out potential occurrence across all of those corridors, pointing out pinch points where connectivity is probably very low and being able to highlight what the likely big threats are in some of those areas. Now let's return to this concept of the false positive model. So having all of this data across a huge area, some areas that were much more data rich than other areas. And so we could borrow strength from where we had a lot of information to fill in the gaps better where we had very little information. And that allowed us to quantify a very small false positive rate, only 5 to 8%. But that, not accounting for that, led to really large differences in how the landscape looked in terms of our interpretation of how valuable it is for jaguar. The picture is much rosier if we ignored that false positive rate. And an independent genetic assessment of connectivity pointed out that up here was the biggest area or biggest point of genetic discontinuity in the jaguar populations. And when we kind of average our probability of use up there in our corrected model, it's about 0.2, so we expect about 20% of that landscape to be used by jaguar. Down here, it's about 50, 60%. And so that says, genetic continuity should be greater, or we think it would be if we ignored this false positives. So I bring that up just because the data we deal with are noisy and they're messy, and we need to meet the data where they are and fit the models to it. And so for students, I always tell students a degree or a minor in statistics is very compatible with a wildlife degree. It will serve you very well in life for these kinds of reasons. And just a quick look then at where the bias was greatest between the correcting for or not correcting for false positives, and it points to the 3 areas where we had the least data because jaguar just weren't there, right? So we just had the least data, and those are the places that it's most important to have the picture right. And so again, knowing how to borrow strength and dealing with large-scale processes and fitting these models, that's where Lisanne really thrived. And I would be remiss to not point out her big conclusion too, that just because things look great in certain areas, you can't take our eye off the ball there, because those also now have the biggest amount of forest to lose, right? And so they are undergoing the fastest rates of current levels of forest loss because the forest is already gone pretty much in other places, right? Okay, so this idea of the forest being gone and fragmented landscapes was the real focus of my grad student Lillian down in the other end of jaguar range. Looking in the Atlantic forest, she wanted to know how much forest do we need to retain to keep the large mammal community intact, right? And so she looked at it in the Atlantic forest along the coast of Brazil, where 72% of the Brazilian population occurs and only 12% of the forest remains. And that block is centered right on basically the city of Sao Paulo right there. And so it's an interesting landscape to work in. And she wanted to look for thresholds in forest amount at which we start losing species. And she knew that where we look matters, because if the world is actively changing around animals, forest loss is happening a lot, it's not a stable situation, and the picture can be misleading in part because of this concept of extinction debt, that we may have blown past that critical threshold in forest, but it takes a while for the population to catch up. And so it may be decades before we actually see the impact on the population. So she convinced me that this is a really great landscape to look at this in, because it's really an aftermath forest, that the deforest rates for the last 20 plus years have been pretty nil. In fact, there's been like 1 to 3% increase in forest in this landscape during that time. So pretty stable conditions. And there had been evidence of the large cats like jaguar starting to come back into some of these forest patches. She also knew that who we look at matters. Because animals have different sensitivities to different landscape features, a lot of studies looking at forest thresholds look at single species, and because species differ in body size, then you end up having a scale very specific to your study species. It makes it hard to compare from place to place and understand potential thresholds in a more community level framework. So she looked at the entire entire community of mammals that she could capture on camera traps in that landscape. And she made sure she sampled blocks that had less than 10% forest all the way up through more than 90% forest. So she was covering that whole gamut. A lot of studies looking at forest thresholds only have up to 50% of the forest remaining anyway in places. And so a lot of the thresholds have been found less than that, partly because they just didn't have the full range. So she looked at a lot of stuff. And yes, jaguar was detected, but not very much. And so one of the first things that surprised us was humans showed up a lot in this landscape. So about 60% of the probability of a human showing up in any of the surveyed blocks. Dogs were everywhere. Everywhere we looked, dogs were. And the dogs were operating completely independently of humans. So there's just free-range dogs all over the place, which is also why there's not many jaguar in the landscape, because jaguar like eating dogs. So we did the two species occupancy between humans and dogs to understand that they're completely operating independently in these landscapes. And whether a dog, human, or both showed up had differential relationships with other species being in that landscape, right? So it's hard to say these are just correlational patterns. You can't say that deer and paca are choosing to be where the dogs and humans are. It could be the other way around, but they were more likely to be found where the dogs and humans were. And a lot of the cats and other species had showed they were less likely to be around where especially where the dogs were showing up. And so obviously we need to account for that kind of effect if we're going to try to isolate the effect of forest. So integrating all the potential human drivers to just control for those effects, she used the human footprint layer, which is a measure of roads and housing density and cleared land and all sorts of things to understand how animals are responding to the human footprint, elevation, so that she can isolate the effect of forest. And doing that, then she was able to plot out across the amount of forest cover, what were the individual species relationships, to look at the community as a whole. This was a community model, so she had community means, but that gives you the ability to also look at individual responses, and that's what she's got plotted up here at the top. And when she lumped these species between habitat generalists and forest specialists, she identified these critical points at which you'd expect a shift in community dominance. And plotted down here is the amount of forest cover at that critical point, depending on what scale of observation we looked at, how big of a grid cell we measured forest amount in. And so there's a lot of studies out there that look at large species who use large area needs and are in the 10 to 40% threshold range. We found the most statistically informative scale across this whole community was a lot smaller, at this 2 by 2 kilometer scale. And at that scale, you needed to retain a lot of forest to keep your forest community intact. Below that level, she saw decreases in species richness, and obviously generalists were favored over forest specialists. And the first ones we were losing, the carnivores and the frugivores in these landscapes. But it's not all, doom and gloom. So we're coming back to the theme that as long as we remove the persecution, the animals can persist, right? And so Alice and Devlin, working with Panthera down in their private ranch in the Brazilian Pantanal, the largest wetland in the world, which you cannot tell from that bottom picture, that's a wetland, but that's what happened through. There's been a lot of ditching and draining for ranching purposes, a lot of drying. The forest is really reduced and very patchy and along riparian corridors. Allison studied jaguar and their large prey use in that ranch, where you could not kill the prey and you could not kill the predators. And so all they did was remove their survival. We expected to see all these density-dependent effects and potential problems and conflict. And a couple of things she found that was really interesting in comparison to the jaguar population in pristine, so-called pristine habitat, our companion spot up the river several hundred kilometers, the Pantanal National Park. This highly modified landscape supported the same number of jaguar as that one up there. And so it really was a surprise. And when she looked at the timing of the activity and the movements of the jaguar using GPS collars and such, and really all signs pointed for the jaguar are keyed into their main prey, to the marsh deer and the other large-bodied prey. They're not paying attention to the cattle. Doesn't mean they're not killing and eating the cattle. They absolutely are. But it's not their main focus, that they really are tied to their natural prey. And so if we can just find creative solutions for the landowners to be able to be more tolerant of livestock losses, then certainly we can keep jaguar in these really fragmented and modified landscapes. And in this particular case, this is right along the, yeah, I'm trying to think of the name of the river right there. But it's a huge, 20 years ago, it was a huge fishing destination, big tourism for fishing. That has completely shifted to jaguar viewing because this ranch is right there and there's all this access, and the jaguar, because the forest is by the river, all the jaguar are by the river. And so it's become this huge opportunity. And so finding this partnership so that some of the tourism money flows back to the ranch to tolerate the losses to jaguar, it's an opportunity in this case. That's clearly not the solution everywhere. There's a lot of places in the world where ecotourism just cannot be the solution. It's just people like soft beds and comfortable lodgings and good food. And so we're not really, hunters are more intrepid is kind of the point I'm getting to. So there are solutions where trophy hunting, even in places of the world, could still be a solution where ecotourism may not be. And so having partnerships that may not be that comfortable at the start could be solutions in some of these landscapes for keeping these animals in the landscape. All right, so exotic animals, faraway locations. I thought I'd bring it back to something a little more, thinking about some of these same themes. And thinking about the northeastern US, my backyard, and my favorite animal, the moose, which is our biggest animal that we have in the Northeast. And so moose, the red line here is their southern range boundary. So this is northeastern New York and the Adirondack Park. And then Moose Range continues up to Maine from there. And when I first, and I love this map because it's from the Forest Service, it's old now, but it shows amount of forest cover on top of human population density. Because again, this is we have the highest rural human population densities in the nation in these states. And so you have to look at it that way to see where the habitat might lay. And the Adirondack Park gives more apparent habitat for moose than neighboring Vermont, New Hampshire combined. And yet when in 2011, when Dave Wattles and Stefano, they did an assessment of what do you really think your numbers are, moose, so humans colonized the West Coast, took away all the trees, decimated the game. We see it in every single species. They were the protected areas that then got established were their strongholds, and then they repopulated as the forest came back. And so from starting in the 60s, they moved into New Hampshire, 70s they got to Vermont, the 80s they walked into New York. That's when I graduated from high school, and I remember the moose coming back and the stray ones that would wander and try to figure out where they're gonna be. What happened in New York that differed from the other states is every other state had an eruptive population growth once moose got in. Not in New York, they just trickled along. And so there are all these questions of why do we have so few moose? We're talking about 6 million acre park that is the largest protected area in the contiguous United States, in theory, right? It's interesting because it's not the same kind of park as, say, Yellowstone. We'll get to that in a second. And so some of the hypotheses put forth about why do we have so few moose involved thermal stress, they're on their southern range boundary, disease because there's a lot of white-tailed deer and brainworm is a big issue in this landscape, and food limitation. This was my pet hypothesis that this is a mature forest landscape. There's no understory. Moose need big bites of food and it just isn't there. And so part of the story definitely will start with the food, right? So first of all, just like Becky Fuda's study from space, you can see the boundaries of the Adirondack Park. I don't need to draw the so-called blue line for you. 45% of that landscape is this forever wild forest preserve. You can't even remove firewood from that area. So no trees are cut. And so they are just very old trees. There's a lot of deer and there is very little understory. So for the majority of this park, there is no food for moose. And we did aerial surveys over a series of years. It's like try to find a needle in a haystack, enormous area, 600 moose. Like it was really challenging to get robust estimates, but over time we built it up and we understood we have a very patchy moose population. And where they occur in any kind of density is in the private lands where timber harvest happens. And so that's where there is food for moose because these are a big bodied animal that need big bites of food, and that comes from that thick regeneration, right? But that also means that our 650 moose, that's a small population size. That's a population at risk of extinction, right? So that's not a lot of moose, but they're in high conflict because they all occur on private lands where they're trying to regenerate the forest, right? And our neighboring states dealt with the impact by cutting more forest. And so they would spread out the impacts, which then of course lead to more moose. And, it's a chicken and egg phenomenon. But our other states also have really high density moose because they were able to, you can see from this picture, we harvest trees very differently than you do out west. We have these belt transects. We have these thin cuts that then have forest next to it, and thin cuts. And Pete Peekins, a longtime moose biologist, he's called it moose nirvana. So we host some of the highest densities of moose, well, not in New York, but our neighboring states host some of the highest densities of moose seen in North America. And so part of the food story then, to really understand it, my grad student Sam Peterson spent a lot of time backtracking GPS collared moose to see what they browsed. He did this in winter and summer, and he would identify where the moose, the foraging patch, if he saw any sign of white-tailed deer, he'd move on, because you just can't reliably distinguish moose from deer in this landscape in terms of just the sign left on trees and shrubs. And so, but doing so, he understood their diets. He then clipped and measured a lot of vegetation to understand the protein and energy content of the forage. He used a range calculator to run simulations and scenarios to see what would be the range-based carrying capacity, what's most limiting to moose in this landscape, and discovered that they are protein limited in their browse. They are protein limited in the summer, and they're getting all their protein from regenerating forest. So clearly, that's the big limiting factor. When he mapped this out to our, it wasn't me, right? When we mapped that out to our aerial survey units, it explains 76% of the variation that we observed in moose density. And energy limitations and winter food availability did not explain nearly that much. So we know we have a food-limited population. However, we also have fat and happy moose. And so when we would hire the helicopter crews, they'd start in Maine and work down through and capture everything, and they'd get to us and they'd say, holy cow, your moose are big and they are healthy, and they are so much more healthy than your neighboring states that have much higher moose densities. So they're food limited, but they're not starving to death. And so we're trying, so there's other things at play here. Shared parasites we know probably play a role. And if you've heard anything about moose in the northeastern US, it may be about these epizootics of winter tick that lead to the ghost moose. And so these animals get over 36,000 ticks just on one side of their body, and they don't clean them off. And deer pick them off. They have little tiny muzzles. They pick them off and preen really effectively, but moose don't. And they lose their hair. They don't die from exposure. They die from anemia. And so the juvenile moose are most vulnerable, and they're dying with full stomachs, but of anemia, because they can't replace the blood volume to the amount of ticks on their system. And it has everything to do with the high density moose in our neighboring states. In New York, the most ticks we've ever seen on a moose was 7. So we don't have it. Our highest densities are the lowest densities of neighboring states. But we got a lot of deer. So in our aerial surveys, we estimated around 16,000 deer sharing this landscape with the 600 and so moose. And when we look at it in terms of occupancy, moose, where the moose are persisting seems to be independent of the density of deer, but it does have something to do with the prevalence of 2 shared parasites that we know kill moose in this landscape. Brainworm being the one we expected, liver fluke being the unexpected one. Most people say, well, they don't die from liver fluke, but they're killing our moose. It's prevalent enough. And so we do see this negative impact of where the moose are persisting. Now, trying to predict where that is and what are the conditions that are fostering the parasite persistence in the landscape. Well, that's the work of our current PhD student, Jen Grauer, co-supervised with Angela Fuller at Cornell. So that story is still unfolding. And we also know climate probably plays a pretty big role on their southern range margin, right? Already more than half of the days that moose experience in summer and winter are warmer than this historical threshold set from a couple of captive moose a long time ago that we should be very suspicious of. But that threshold was where they start basically exhibiting thermal stress. right? And so the expectation was that our moose are just, they're thermally stressed, but there's a lot of adaptive capacity. We have a lot of wetlands and forest cover that they can move into, and they've been able to persist just fine. In fact, they're living in oak woodlands in Massachusetts, in these tiny little areas in the Berkshires. They have 900 moose. They have more moose than we have, and it's really warm. It's a very weird ecosystem, and they're persisting fine, except for when they have a tick epizootic. So Claire Teitelbaum, who worked with the Northeast Climate Change, USGS Climate Change Center, did a lot of modeling with our data, with the neighboring states to model out how suitable moose habitat looks now and under the best case future conditions in the low emissions scenario. And it's pretty clear that moose habitat is going to shrink and move under climate change. And very clearly the future conditions favor deer and parasites over moose in this landscape. And so what will the role of protected areas be? Well, to be able to add young forest where it may show, where the moose may need it in the future, would require a constitutional convention to change that forest preserve and allow us to cut forest. Nobody's going to open up a constitutional convention for moose to let us cut trees. So basically it's a wait and see. We'll see if there's any value and whether we can keep moose in this landscape. All right, so just a couple of parting thoughts here is this first bullet point. It goes back to my undergraduate, Professor Aaron Moen at Cornell, who said there are no easy answers to complicated questions, and no matter how simple your wildlife question seems, it's really, really difficult. There's so much uncontrolled variation in what we're dealing with. There's never a fix it and forget it situation. There's so much context sensitivity, and it can be really, really challenging. And for my students and for the students in the audience, I say, don't be hamstrung by all the uncertainty that you're facing and all of the challenges. That embrace that, be honest about the evidence you have, how good it is, test your assumptions. This is where having a statistical background can be really helpful to make sure that you are finding that signal and all that noise and helping direct conservation effectively. And you're not in it alone. I wasn't in it alone, right? Like a lot of people, you need the people who know what the tracks look like on the ground. You need the people who work in the communities and can understand their needs and what's going to work for them and be a solution. You need the people who go out and find the money to pay those guardians to get in between the lions and the people. And then you need my array of graduate students to sit there and figure out how to make the data work, right? And to get robust inference into that. It takes all of us and an army of ESF undergrads to process those photos, because we did a lot of that before AI would make it a lot faster. All right, thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it. Wow. Yes, Erica.
So I might have missed this, but why are there so many deer in the Adirondacks when it has such a great landmass? Where are all the predators of them?
What predators?
Of deer.
I know. We have black bear, and black bear, across deer range, black bear are the biggest maybe consumer of fawns. Bears are a big effect, but we don't have enough black bear to touch our deer. Our deer are beyond predator limitation in these landscapes. There's so much heterogeneity in our forests in terms of lots of edge effects and things that deer benefit from, that nothing is keeping our deer in check except for food availability. And so they are just, our numbers are huge.
No wolves?
Oh no, not anywhere in the Northeast, no. Okay. Being the person running the New York Mammal Survey, I can tell you there have been 3 verified sightings of wolves in New York State, but we do not have a population. Yeah, they were completely extirpated. The closest population is Algonquin Park up in Canada, and there's a lot of rangeland and things they would need to get through, and a lot of persecution of coyotes and in between. It'd be tough for a wolf to make it. One occasionally does. Yeah.
Is there any talk of reintroduction?
There's lots of talk of reintroduction. It's pretty cyclical, and they have talked about it. And the issue is that 16,000 deer sounds like a lot of deer. you'd be hard pressed to find a deer in the Adirondacks. It's low density because it's such big space. Where all the deer are on the periphery, where there's more heterogeneity in the forest, and so all the wolves would go right out to where everybody lives on the edges, and it would be tricky. It would be tricky. Yeah. They reintroduced lynx, and all of them left. There just isn't that. So that closed canopy forest isn't good for our hare. We've had a long-term decline in snowshoe hare. It's really a low productivity system in terms of the diversity of prey. And we saw that. We did coyote diet studies. And up there, they eat fawns and they eat beaver. Everywhere else in the state, there's like 50 different things on their diet, right? But it's just a low diversity system in the Adirondacks. Yeah. Sure.
How willing do you feel rural communities take on like these non-lethal solutions to deal with big prey?
I think it depends. Well, first of all, there's a lot of motivation because there's a lot of motivation for the people who want to keep the predators in the landscape. And when we show up with our money and put money to the problem, people will be interested to some degree as long as it benefits the community. So community-based conservation are the things that have persistence in a lot of the world. If you just try to come in and impose something on them and then it's fickle money sources and there's no longevity and there aren't people key in the community who keep that consistency in place and give the right feedback to the right people to make sure the money can keep coming, then yeah, it's going to fall down. And if there's corruption, all bets are off, and there's a lot of corruption in the world. But there's some really great examples of bottom-up community-based conservation that's very successful. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah.
If there's one thing you can tell an undergraduate that's interested in this field, like modeling and species distribution, what would you say?
Good for you to start with. Yes, because we do need the modelers, and a lot of students want to go chase fuzzy animals and have no interest in that whatsoever, and it takes all of us, right? And so definitely seek out those extra quantitative courses, anything. If you're not aware of certification by the Wildlife Society, see what kinds of things they require, because they do require a lot more statistics and quantitative-based courses than you might think in a standard and typical educational programs. And so seek those things out for yourself, and you'll be happy. We'll be happy to have you.
I used to follow up on that. Out of curiosity, what's your previous work been with Panthera?
With Panthera, so Panthera has an office in New York City, and so that's only a 3.5-hour drive from Syracuse. And we had a good relationship starting with Luke Hunter down there. He was at that main office, and they had so Lisanne was staff at Panthera, my one student. Allison had been a student they had already supported, and so they knew of me and my work, and they kind of directed those students to kind of take a look at me and then give them support for it. And so we just built up a good working relationship over time for that. Yeah.
And this is more of a random question, but I'm originally from Long Island, New York,
Ah.
and what is the likelihood of coyote expansion into like that area? I've not been living there for a few years, but I've been slowly watching some of the reports of coyotes slowly making their way towards it.
Oh yeah, so there are coyotes on Long Island now for sure, and boy, coyotes in New York have been an interesting situation, and there are actually now signs in New York City that are a picture of a coyote saying, "Native New Yorker, I'm a New Yorker." And so they're trying to be more wildlife friendly in the city. But I gave a talk yesterday about rodenticides, and every single one of those coyotes is getting exposed to rodenticides in the city. And so it's a tricky balance. People like them being around. There was the Gotham coyote study, where they went to every green space they could find across Manhattan, the most dense areas of New York City. Every place they put a camera up, they found a coyote. And people have no idea that they're just living in and among them. So it's quite interesting. Yeah. But here's the thing that's amazing on the East Coast. People are as equally loving and hating coyotes as they are about wolves out west. I can't believe it. Coyotes. Like, there's too many coyotes. Why do you have this behavior with coyotes? But they do. Yeah. Erica.
From friends of mine, anyway, who live around Massachusetts, Connecticut, coyotes eat cats. they eat their pets.
Sure, they eat a lot of small dogs too. In fact, in the Hudson Valley, there was a study Cornell did to understand, they were trying to haze coyotes to see if they could change behavior and keep them from coming in and eating people's pets because they were getting picked off as they're walking their dog. Little dogs were getting picked off of the leash. And so, and like so many other hazing studies that I have looked at before is you have all the best intentions, and then when you look for them, you can't find a problem animal to work with. And so they couldn't get a coyote to be a problem at the time they were trying to study them. So it was just fascinating that, yeah. But Gordon Batchelor, the former chief of wildlife in the state, would say, along with coyotes in urban areas and overpopulation of deer in urban, there's no solution but deletion. You really, some animals you just can't work with. Yes.
So you talked a lot about like how in environmental statistics, a lot of times you get these false positives and false negatives and outside factors and everything else that makes a lot of uncertainty. And then you closed it with, embracing uncertainty. Mm-hmm. In your studies, did you ever find a point where you were able to kind of put uncertainty aside and say, actually, I'm feeling rather certain now that this data is starting to look...
Not once, no. As in, you can't ever make definitive statements without talking about how certain you are about it, right? Because always there's some evidence that is much stronger than others. And so I think what's important when you're presenting research, I mean, today I just kind of touched on some highlights, and I didn't really go into the way I would present levels of evidence if I was talking to a public audience trying to say, here's how you should make changes for managing things. But I think it's incumbent on us to make sure we're being very honest about the strength in our data, the weaknesses in our data, how certain we are of our conclusions, and talking in terms of lines of evidence and weight of evidence. And so yeah, I try not to make definitive statements without having some level of support behind it. I glossed over a lot of that tonight because I figured everyone wanted to see pictures of big cats. But yeah, when working with the agencies and working with the partners and finding solutions, it's really important to not ignore the uncertainty, I think. Yeah.
When you had the graph that was showing when the lines were most likely to come back, it looked like the subadults were actually more likely to come back than the older ones, and I just would have thought that the subadults would have been more easy to scare off. So did you know why they were more likely? Well,
there's the complicating factor of whether the subadults were part of a larger group or not at the time, or versus operating independently. Like, were they part of a pride, or were they independent operators? And it was those juvenile males who don't have a pride, who are just a couple of them running around, that were most amenable to behavioral change. But yeah, once these animals are in prides and they're in those community lands, it seemed to flip, that those pride members were not going anywhere. They were pretty entrenched. Yeah, and even the subadults, when they're part of that pride, established pride. And I think I said it, but I didn't show data for it, that females with cubs were the ones who, they had the most to lose, they had the most to gain from being able to kill livestock and provision, and they were the hardest ones to change behavior from and push off. And they're also the hardest ones to say, let's kill those. So it's a real challenging situation for out there, yeah. Yeah, there are no easy answers, yeah. Yeah.
In the Northeast, what do you think are the most important and realistic conservation actions and management actions to take to continue to promote connectivity throughout the landscape?
Well, so interestingly, and I was going to put up a slide for this, one of the biggest initiatives is a young forest initiative. So we have a lot, so what our protected areas do well in the Northeast is protect big old trees. Nobody wants to cut them. Everybody hates the idea of clear cutting. And so the Ruffed Grouse Society, government agencies, a lot of other nonprofit groups and private landowners, are trying to rebrand cutting to young forest, right? And young forest being suitable for all these young forest dependent species. And they're trying to create a network of young forests, starting with the New England cottontails, which I know you have experience with. They haven't yet added moose into that mix, but I think moose are an important one for them to consider for that too. But so that's one of the biggest initiatives. And otherwise, there's so much forest that really the connectivity is there. I was shocked to move from Alberta, Canada to New York and learn that, well, black bear had just been expanding their whole range, and bobcats had come back, and fisher were expanding their range, and river otter recovered. I'm like, where am I? Like, this is not what I expected in New York State, right? But after we cleared all that forest and had all this agriculture, a lot of that land went fallow, and it's come back to forest. And now we're about 20 years past that, and all the animals are repopulating that forest. And so I think the connectivity is kind of just fine if you're a forest animal. But if you're grassland-dependent species, that's where all of our endangered and rare species are, and where all the action is. Yeah. Thank you very much. Have a great night.